Perfect. Well, thanks everyone for finding the time. It's nice to meet you all. I'm Stephen. So I guess in terms of how kind of I got to where I am today. So essentially, I'd say almost straight after university, I had a job for about a year somewhere else. But I'd say that was kind of like, I don't know, probably wasn't what I wanted to do long term. And then the first thing we kind of worked on was an education software business. How did we get into that? I guess when you're younger, you're 21, 22, probably most of what you've been exposed to is education. I guess most people with the businesses they're working on, it's kind of like you notice a problem, you notice something that you think you can improve or solve, and then from there you set about trying to solve it. I'd say when we started out, we were pretty, I'd say, young and naive. You learn quite quickly, but what was the core concept? We wanted to build something that was free. Like I went to state school, so did most of our early team. Basically wanted to build something in education that was free, so you could get the best experience possible free of charge. More fun. I'd say most of the stuff we did at school when we were young was pretty, I'd say, unengaging. You'd have kind of your mobile phone or whatever, you'd have super engaging things on there. You'd use Duolingo if you were learning kind of languages for fun. Then you'd be at school and you'd learn technology that was pretty outdated, not very gamified, not very interesting. And we tried to kind of bridge that gap with something that was fun, free, and then also use cognitive science to help students learn more effectively. That's what we did. I think we started that back in 2017 now, so not too long ago, but I guess that's how we started. Initially, I don't know, it was very hard to raise money. Like we didn't have a track record. We had 22, we hadn't done the thing before, and then we had to work to, in essence, build everything from scratch with no credibility, which isn't the easiest. We kind of know, like it's kind of, now that we've kind of been through the business journey once, it's like night and day in terms of how people talk to you. I think we had loads and loads of meetings. Most people reject you when you're fundraising. We did manage to raise some money from people I'd worked with, but also some extended connections. And then from there, it was kind of studying about building. So I guess that was a company called Seneca that grew to, I think, I don't know, 14 million total signed up users in terms of monthly actives. Now it's probably 4 million monthly actives. And then we sold that business in 2022. I think we'll go into that in a little bit more detail later on. And now kind of left that earlier this year and now starting a new business, kind of bridging accounting services and accounting technology, which some of you have spoken to that a little bit before. But I think we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Maybe leave it there for an introduction so we can discuss some more things along the way in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good. So you mentioned a little bit about raising external funding from friends and family. How much was that out of interest?
So the first round we did was 150,000, and that was SCIS. Then we were able to raise kind of 1 million and then 1 million again, both at staggered intervals. So in total, we probably raised 2 million, which is obviously fairly sizable, but not kind of like enormous in the kind of VC landscape. That was kind of pretty tough early on.
Was the other 1 million again from angel investors or VCs, or a mix?
We did that. We did all of it from angel investors. I'd say it probably wasn't a family and friends round in kind of the definitional sense. It was more people I'd worked with and kind of thought it would be kind of a potentially credible investment. But then the rest was angels, probably not from, I mean, that worked out well given the business size that we built. Like it wasn't going to be like a unicorn, which I think is what VCs are particularly focused upon. But yeah, I guess we tried to raise from VCs, but frankly, we didn't have much luck. We didn't need VC. I guess like if you need money to source your business, it doesn't have to be from place A or place B. Like realistically, there are times you can get lots and lots of expertise from venture capitalists, and if that's not possible, you can still learn more things from first principles yourself and just build out. Fundamentally, you should have a plan and you should execute the plan using money rather than kind of raising X amount of money and using it to raise more and more money. That can work in some business models, but it's not really necessary. You should use your business as the kind of launch pad to decide how much to raise and what is needed, rather than the other way around, which I think can be like quite a common trend.
Do you remember how many individual angel investors you had on your cap table at the end? Because that's a question that a lot of people have, is like, how many is it possible to manage before it starts getting a bit too much?
I'd say loads, probably too many, but it's only too many in an administrative sense once a year. Like fundamentally, our investors were great. Like everyone was very supportive. Nobody was kind of really a nightmare asking for bespoke information, asking a lot of questions. And I would say that's a fortunate experience from our side. And I've spoken to other people who've had less fortunate experiences there, where I'd say, like, this is something I try and use as a lens when investing now, but it's like, if I have to do bespoke work for an investor, that is time not spent on the business. Like it's very important to maintain good relationships and make sure you're keeping everyone in the loop of your progress. You're kind of doing what you would want if you were on the other side of the table, so people know you're doing the right things with the money and you're not kind of doing insane stuff. But at the same time, like realistically, if you're diverting your attention towards managing a set of investors, the opportunity cost is working with the team, working on products, working with customers. So that's kind of a balance. And I'd say from like a probability basis, the more people you have, the more likely it is you have some people who divert attention away from the core of the business. We were super lucky. Everyone was very supportive. And I'd say, I don't know, when you go through an exit process, one of the nice things is kind of actually working with people you get along with and have a nice time with and delivering returns. It's not really necessarily all financial, but the journey together is part of the nice thing. So I would say I would recommend having angels. Once you're at like 100 or 200, the admin's probably like to be very high. We probably had 30 to 40 individuals at the end. So that is like a manageable thing to do.
Yeah. Okay, there's a bunch of questions that we could ask about fundraising, and I saw one coming on the chat, which we'll come back to later, because we want to talk a bit more about the growth journey and what led to the exit. So one thing that we've been talking to founders about, and just for context, there's kind of two different stages of founders that joined Hotbed Summer. There's people that are raising for the very first time, so they might be raising that 150k friends and family round, and there are people that have already raised that round and now looking for a seed round, or might be raising from people that they don't know for the first time, or looking at approaching VCs or that kind of thing. Did you have, with your initial 150k round, like, these are the key KPIs I want to hit, and then when I get to that stage of growth, then I know it's time to raise again, and then again, like, here's the KPIs that I want to hit, and then I can prove to the investors that we're kind of building momentum? Is that how it was, kind of strategically? And was there anything that went better or worse than expected with that process?
So I'd say we weren't great back then. Like, we weren't very experienced. We probably didn't know what we were doing that well. I'd say that's the approach we took, but the kind of milestones and KPIs that we probably would have selected probably would have been wrong. So I'd say, I think to build like trust and credibility with investors, the most important thing is doing what you say you'll do, or at least, I mean, everyone understands starting a new business is difficult and you've got to be ambitious, but at least coming close to. I'd say my view of how you build trust and credibility is, if you say you'll do X, ideally you do at least X. You basically, like, sometimes you might share an ambitious plan and you're at 80%. I think the problems are mainly when you're either nowhere near, or you're nowhere near and it's a surprise. Like, you might choose to change the focus of the business, the distribution channels, the product. You should listen to what customers want and do whatever they kind of guide you towards. But if you're going to do that, people who've given you money to do A must understand and know why you're doing B instead, and why that changes what you're focused on. So the main thing is, I mean, it's mainly communication. If you're doing things, making progress, changing things, explain to people why you think that's a good decision. And I'd probably also be receptive to some feedback on the KPIs, because I would say what we were focused on was probably wrong. And if you have more experienced kind of people suggesting things, obviously it's your business. Some people will give you advice and you need to completely ignore it. Some people give you advice, you take on bits of it. Some people give you advice and you say, wow, that's amazing. And you'll have the whole spectrum. Your job is to listen to all of it and find the elements of truth in each thing to try and inform the view. So someone may say something and you think that's actually what we should be doing. Sometimes you just need to say that's not quite applicable because you have the context on your business that no one else will have. I think I've kind of talked myself into a kind of frenzy. Is there any other component of the kind of fundraising process that would be good to kind of go over?
I guess with having a free product, how that tied into fundraising conversations. So did you end up charging schools, or was there another pricing model outside of the end user paying for it, or were you focusing on user acquisition and then you used that as part of your fundraising strategy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the model evolved enormously over the years, probably mainly due to exogenous stuff. But in essence, the first focus starting out was how do you build something that is better? And I'd say the product is super important and making something better matters a lot, but then you do have to think about how are people going to find out about it and use it, because a lot of businesses, it's kind of like, I'm going to build this amazing thing and then people are going to hear about it through Google ads, Facebook ads, those kinds of things. Normally, that kind of acquisition strategy doesn't work so well, because if someone else builds something that's similar and you're all just competing on Google ads and Facebook ads, you'll spend as much money as you can to acquire someone, and actually all the money ends up in Google and Facebook's pockets and you're kind of break even. You need to think about both the product side but also the customer side. Those are the two most important ones. In terms of what we started out with the product. How do you make it fun, free, more effective? Those were like the three tenets we wanted. I would say people probably prefer things being fun relative to more effective. There's the kind of like, I should eat vegetables, but actually I want to eat Deliveroo kind of thing. So you kind of have to balance like a principle that you want to stick to versus actually what consumers want. And realistically, your customer is your customer. If they don't want to use your product, you don't really exist. So you have to kind of decide which principles are foundational, fundamental, you stick to at all costs, and which ones are actually market feedback of this is what people want to build. And then you have to say, here's what we've decided to build, here's what we want to build, and here's what we want to work on, and here's what customers want. You've got to try and match them together with the products you build. So that was the focus. And then in terms of monetization, honestly, we just built some stuff we thought would be good, turned it on, and people happened to buy, which I think is partly because there was affinity to a product that people enjoyed using and was good. But I would say that's kind of like, from my perspective, quite scary, because equivalently, you could have done that, people wouldn't have bought. It's not like a mechanistic thing where you understand why. But I think that was partially because of affinity, partially because of the features, but kind of launching an MVP, that was kind of like a binary moment where it worked or didn't work. And kind of a lesson that I would probably share is that binary lesson is 2 years in and hundreds of thousands spent, and you should not be at that stage of a business doing that. Like, that is just a stroke of good fortune that you've done something 2 years in and it's worked. There are obviously steps to get there, and there's a bit of a debate around a minimum viable product where you just put anything out there quickly, and then like a minimum, I guess it's still a minimum viable product. What is the definition of viable? Like, I think people confuse like landing page tests and those kind of things with actually building a core product that people can use, at least to a degree, that fulfills kind of a job to be done. But fundamentally, that should not be 2 years in. That should be 1 week in, 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in. And the job should be, how can we constrain the scope of work so that that doesn't have a whole organization behind it, money raised, capital committed, before you're finding out if people will pay or not. I think we should have done that sooner, but we were kind of fortunate in the stuff we'd done, although not validated, worked. but you should be validating that. And then I think our mindset changed after that, but that was just a product of inexperience where you continually rationalize, oh, if we do this, if we do this, if we do this, then it will be great. But actually, you need to test if you do X, do customers want it or not as quickly as possible? Customers being consumers or businesses. So we were mainly B2C. B2C, it's easier to acquire consumers with a free product, a freemium product. They're not very sticky. I mean, schools in it especially aren't. I mean, kids will try lots of stuff. Will they stay or not is a different question. And then COVID, I think it's a strange one, but everyone thinks COVID would have been great because we were like an online learning thing. It was great for usage, but then we had the kind of paid stuff we'd launched that was premium on top of the whole free tier that millions of people were using, was all to do with examinations. So I think they got cancelled in 2020 to 2022. So you basically had 3 years where you had no way of making any money. Obviously, some people still purchase, but then we had to change our kind of approach completely and offer more to schools, because suddenly the people who used to pay now had no kind of, I guess it's a binary, it's not quite binary, but do you have exams or not? If not, it's going to be very hard to convert people to pay for that kind of stuff. So then we focused more on schools. What did they want? How did they use the products, and what could we do to support them? But yeah, it's quite turbulent. I'd say the ideal, again, is not that you're changing your kind of business model and product focus 4 years into a business, but kind of worked out in the end. But there's, I guess actually that's the nature of startups. No, stuff changes, and you just got to kind of change with it.
You've got to respond to what's going on in the market, and no one could have predicted what would have happened in COVID. So just sticking to your business model. If it's not going to work, you're going to have to pivot somehow. At what point did Go Student, like at what point did you have a relationship with? So Go Student was a company that acquired you, but with a lot of acquisition stories, we hear about the relationship being formed actually quite far in advance of the acquisition and not even necessarily relating to an acquisition. How did it happen for you?
So I don't know how typical we were. So we'd never really talked about any acquisitions with anyone ever. And then in 2021, I guess there's sometimes things are different in the market, and you kind of have to recognize that. But in 2021, there were a lot of different companies of different sizes, some kind of private equity backed, some doing different strategies, some publicly listed, and then Go Student, who all were kind of interested in acquiring us. I think it was a coalescence of like many different factors, but fundamentally COVID meant everyone converged into the same space, because I guess traditionally the organizing principle had been you have school and you have like supplementary stuff that people kind of do separately, with a lot of people not actually attending school physically and schools shutting down for extended periods. Everyone was kind of forced into the same position. And that position was kind of permanent, kind of temporary. But you had companies organizing tutoring, trying to provide everything else that would do the job that a tutor can't do, because a tutor often is too expensive to do like 8 hours, 9 hours of education each day, because fundamentally it's traditionally one-to-one, and the cost of that's like disproportionate relative to going to school. So it's kind of like, how do you combine that element? And then we at the same time would test tutoring initiatives and push into that area. And I guess we saw that dynamic where everyone in the sector was being forced to do stuff they were not. I guess like tutoring is very operational, very organizational, very high personnel, and we were quite a small software team. And when everyone's being forced to do stuff they're not particularly comfortable doing, but then need to provide, it kind of forces different decisions to get made. So some people we spoke to, we had existing partnerships with, we were doing work for, and they kind of had discussions with us. And then others, it was kind of more outreach. People introduced you and would say, you're doing stuff in a similar sector. How could you work together and discuss that? And I'd say the velocity with which that happened in kind of COVID was like 100x what it had been previously. Because I guess the industry had to change really quickly. And one way of changing is either you do it yourself, you partner, or you kind of acquire and merge. And that was the dynamic I saw.
So it was a mixture of inbound people coming to you because they knew you, and outbound once you had it in your head that this was a that you could get acquired, you would then go out and speak to potential acquirers.
So we did no outbound, as in we weren't kind of deciding to sell. There wasn't like a process. We didn't appoint a bank to say we're selling the company. It was genuinely just, I'd say, largely inbound with different partners discussing different avenues. Some would kind of discuss taking minority stakes. Some would discuss acquisitions. Some would discuss partnerships. Some would discuss buying 3 companies at the same time and trying to push them into new entities. I'd say it was quite like I'd say an innovative financial time, but I guess that's the pressure caused by kind of a market that is becoming popular, becoming more important, and actually no one really has the size and scale to do everything.
Backtracking a little bit from that, how do you think they knew about you? Like, did you have, you obviously had 13 million students or something using the product, so that definitely helped. But did you make a point about shouting about your growth and your success on LinkedIn, or like how do you think those companies like GoStudent knew of who you were?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd say generally I like hiding personally. Say this on a recorded interview, so maybe not do the best job. But I'd say generally, like, we were not the most sociable or outward. I would say I do think maybe that was an error in hindsight. It obviously didn't matter, but we did in COVID do more articles because there was more inbound where people asked you to do interviews, news interviews, and stuff like that. How much does that matter? It definitely, like, if your strategy is to grow customers and build a business based on that, I think it's very difficult because you basically get a one-off spike and then everything goes back to normal before. It doesn't change the business or retention. But in terms of credibility for buyers, it may have helped, it may not have helped. I think probably we'd been around for 4 or 5 years. We'd got to a point where if you were looking, we would appear. And in the early stages, it's like, who are these tiny providers? They don't rank well. If you do user interviews, you don't come up. I guess what processes would people follow to look at it? Personal introductions, I guess, like SimilarWeb and kind of website rankings and that kind of stuff. Some people we spoke to, we had personal relationships with. So obviously you kind of know people doing that. But I'd say this is probably a stroke of good fortune rather than we weren't very good at being prominent or kind of, we had a very, I think, strong brand with our user base, but our user base is like schools. It's not people like buying companies.
What was it about GoStudent that stood out? But if there were loads of kind of different types of offers on the table, why did you decide to go for the acquisition offer, and why was it GoStudent that stood out to you?
So I guess there's a few things. Like, we did explore some minority offers where someone buys X% of the company and then you kind of have a joint vision towards what happens there. I got some very good advice from different people I'd kind of met over time who basically outlined you effectively have someone who has a set of incentives that is completely different to yours. Like, if you're in a shareholder base with all your investors, everyone wants the same thing fundamentally. There can be slight divergences, but everyone wants the same thing. If you have someone who owns 40% of your company, they in effect have a blocking stake to decide what you're doing. Not completely, but almost. And their vision is different because by nature they run a different business. So actually it's kind of a very irreversible decision that sounds really good because you're like, great, I can keep doing this and nothing will change and it'll be the same. But fundamentally, that I was generally advised wasn't a good idea. I don't know if that's true. There are probably some instances where it works, some where it doesn't. But that was one thing. The other, I mean, fundamentally, there are some kind of in any, I guess if you have more than one, or like in our case, multiple buyers, there are some kind of I mean, there are some offers you just shouldn't accept where your business could easily be worth above X in valuation. Therefore, if someone else was X minus 5, X minus 10, then you shouldn't engage with that. So that's kind of one kind of tier. The other tier is, I think, culturally, I mean, they had a very different organization. Like we were a very small team, they were a very large team, they were growing very quickly. We'd always been quite conservative and slower moving. But I think realistically, a lot of it is, could you work with the people? And we met with their team, different layers, quite a lot. They were people we could work with. They were kind of, I'd say, similar in age profile to us, which I think it's not hugely important in any acquisition, but it does help if you meet people and there's kind of I guess, way of working that's kind of agile, innovative, etc. It's very different to joining a company that's 200 years old versus a company that's 5 years old. So I think there's a lot of factors you have to weigh up. I don't necessarily know well enough or have seen enough processes to prescribe, but for us, I think it works. And when we worked there, we had a great time, enjoyed it, and learned a lot from a different kind of organization that obviously raised a lot more money, growing a lot more quickly, and saw like a different side and a different way of approaching a business, which hopefully has taught us stuff that we can take forward with our next company.
The whole kind of exit process, beginning to end, from first conversation to signing the paperwork to then walking away, how long was that?
I reckon we started talking in August and finished in February, so it is not quick. There are periods where nothing will happen for 3 or 4 weeks, and then there are periods where enormous amounts happen for days and nights. I guess, I mean, fundamentally, if you're kind of like looking for like what is the main takeaway, and I'd say this not from just my experience but other experiences too, it's kind of like the average purchase and the average company that buys another company is probably looking to buy something that's profitable. Like we were in that position, we've been profitable for a few years. Like once you're not profitable, it has to be very bold or very strategic for someone, I think. And obviously there are different businesses, like this advice doesn't scale everywhere. Like there are some businesses where that wouldn't make sense. Like I guess if you're looking at like Instagram social network, when Facebook bought that, they obviously understand the economics perfectly of what's getting bought. They would not advocate trying to build that profitably when you can develop a network effect business. But I guess from like the human enterprise perspective, if you've got a company buying you, you have to go through probably stages of approval, different people recommending different stuff. And not being profitable is quite a big checklist in some companies. Like we spoke to different, more traditional old school organizations, and when they're kind of looking at that, I'd say they're pretty conservative, therefore they don't buy that much anyway, but not being profitable would basically end the process. So it depends where your fit is, what your industry is, but many places just wouldn't entertain that as a consideration. So I'd say that's the main kind of takeaway. It's long. There's a lot of ups and downs in the process. You basically have to manage the business assuming it's not going to work, because you can't, if it's a 6-month process, you can't have 6 months where you're just kind of like hanging around expecting / hoping something to happen. You've kind of got to like try and emotionally separate day-to-day work and then what happens there. And then eventually I just stopped working in the business and kind of just focused on the deal exclusively because it was too much to do. But that's only because you got a great team around you who can help out and take on a lot of the workload. Basically, you become a bird. Sorry.
No, that's all right. I was just wondering whether being like the little guy who's getting acquired by the big guy, did you feel like you could negotiate, or did you negotiate on any of the terms?
Um, oh, I'd say the whole thing's a negotiation. Um, and I don't know, like I'd say the core is like before you once you have lawyers involved on both sides, things become quite, I'd say this is from like a position of inexperience. They shouldn't be like this, but once you have lawyers involved, things just become a bit fraught emotionally. And it's not necessarily because anything you're doing or anything the counterparty's doing. Like fundamentally, I don't know if it's our situation or not, but there are times where there's miscommunications and you would attribute that to them when actually their lawyers have done something or they're humans, they've got something wrong. And you're like, oh, this has gone wrong. It's kind of like, I mean, I'd say you need to basically maintain good faith because we would have had the same thing where there's a misunderstanding or our lawyers want something that we don't want. And so you've got to be very firm with that. Often lawyers can argue stuff you don't want because it's interesting or fun. That's not interesting or fun for you. So I'd be pretty firm on what you do and don't want because there are times you look at something and you're like, didn't we say we didn't want this like last week? And then it's just still being argued about. Like that can become a bit of a charade that you need to separate yourself from. But the key is there a framework agreement that you're happy with? Fundamentally, the negotiation that happens after that should be minor. I think it becomes a bit of a theatre in itself because everyone has an incentive to make it a bit of a theatre, not either company, but lawyers, risk aversion. I think you basically got to maintain big picture throughout and then try and zoom out. As long as the fundamentals are good, don't get caught up in like you obviously you need to sign something you're happy with, but it can just become an unnecessary nightmare, which like I think it does happen a lot. Though I don't think this is like an isolated instance. It's just quite a high stress environment where everyone wants to get everything right, and in that you end up discussing and disputing stuff. It's just kind of when you zoom out and look back on it, you're kind of like you think it's mad, but at the time you can get pretty caught up in.
Yeah. Just for the founders here, we're going to move to Q&A in probably about another 5 minutes or so. There are some questions coming in on the chat, which we'll run through. If you do have a question that you want to ask live, you can use the raise hand function, which is on the React button at the bottom of your screen. There's a question on the chat specifically about the acquisition, so I'll cover that whilst we're talking about it. Were there any terms you didn't think about before that you would suggest founders to look out for?
I'd say nothing in general. It's probably very business specific and lawyer specific. I'd say different stuff will be relevant for different business. I know that's like a useless answer, so apologies, but probably like more case by case.
Did you spend some time with the team? Because I know with a lot of acquisitions, they acquire the team as well, and then they're locked in to work at that new company for 12 months or 24 months or whatever it might be. Did you spend any time with the Go Student team to get them kind of trained up on how to use your products as part of the acquisition?
So it was kind of partially COVID. So a lot of it was Zoom, which is not ideal at the time. We met the senior team in person before on multiple, I think a couple of occasions, different people at different times. But I'd say I do think that was a positive for just knowing there is alignment. I'd say in being able to get on, but also the way of work. Like you need to be able to work together. And I don't know, we've partnered with some organizations before this where the way of work was excruciating. And that isn't kind of like a fun layup to spending multiple years. So I'd say that is a positive, but I'd say also meeting people doesn't give you an idea of how day-to-day work is. So that might not scale. Like they were amazing with us. They let us kind of get on autonomously like gave us the support we needed. I think it was as good as it could have been. And obviously you can't necessarily work out how things work versus meeting people casually. But yeah, we were very fortunate in that respect.
This is quite a big question, and you've kind of touched on a few of the answers along the way already. But obviously, you've now started another business, Novabook. Maybe if you can, top 3 lessons from your entire time beginning to end at Seneca that you've learned that you're going to change how you approach Novabook.
Good question. It's a big question. I would say customer feedback. I know it's like the classic, like Y Combinator, all that advice, but fundamentally it's like, does your customer use what you provide? Does your customer pay for what you provide? And don't self-rationalize that it's all good and you don't need to do that. But you need to spend more time on that. And it's so easy to hide. You want it to succeed, you've raised money, you need to make it succeed to make people happy or not feel like a failure. But hiding from customers is the psychological like safety mechanism that you basically just need to avoid, because if you do that, you will never find out, but you will spend way longer on something that you shouldn't, whether it's different product, different market, whatever it is. Like that, I feel like avoiding customers is the way you hide from the fear that it might go wrong. That's like the ultimate. I'd say the other bit is knowing what kind of business you're in. This isn't probably from my journey at Seneca, but a VC-backed business is very different to like a business. They're completely separate categories, I think, to some degree. And I think a lot of people, if you choose the wrong category, it's pretty hard to get out of, basically. I've got people who've run different types of businesses, different stuff. It's like I would say, if you raise money from VCs and you think you're going to build £1 billion company and actually it's a £20 million company, that's still a great outcome if you have the right setup, the right cap table, the right structure, and you kind of recognize it from the start. I'd say again, like, how big is the market that you're working in and how big is the business? Because I'd say everyone starting out thinks it's £1 billion market. I think it links to one of the questions in the chat. It's like, what were the hurdles? Are you raising VC? Like, yeah, our business wasn't a VC backable business in the sense that you can tell yourself you can expand internationally and do everything and do it for everything. But in practice, it's really hard to do everything. So in practice, if you do what you do, where you're doing it, with what's most likely to be done, is it an enormous business or not? And I'd say it's not just like I can just go back. It's kind of like it changes the kind of capital you get, whether it's like ordinary shares or preference shares. It changes the dynamic of the business, and it means, it changes the whole exit outcome. I'd say we wanted to raise VC, we couldn't. We were very fortunate we couldn't, because we shouldn't have done. But I'd say it does take like a very rational assessment of how big the market is to make that decision.
When you were pitching on your original deck, did you have the total addressable market, that kind of market opportunity slide with VC acceptable numbers? But then when they started drilling down into your go-to-market strategy or your future plans, that's when the whole, is it VC backable or is it more of an angel opportunity? Is that when that came up?
I'd say we probably had massive numbers where you're like, the global education market is X, and that's not like a way to try and raise VC. We actually believed it, but you actually believe it because you're so emotionally invested in it that you're like, this has to happen. And actually in practice, I'd say generally I would not include a top-down total addressable market calculation without a bottom-up one now. And if there isn't a bottom-up TAM, it's kind of scary, because it's like anyone can find a number that says something's big. Fundamentally, what you need is a bottom up of like, we're going to have this many customers paying us this. Here is like what's going to happen, because realistically, like, if you look at the global education market, you take the headline number you see and you're like, oh, that's reassuring, we can build a big business. But then you look at it and it's like, I don't know what percentage would be school facilities and teacher salaries of that headline number, but it must be 80% plus. And then if you actually look at the discretionary spend, additional supplementary education, you can delude yourself. It's like, oh, we might replace a textbook if this is great. And then you think about it, it's like schools aren't going to get rid of textbooks. So then you're kind of like, your pool of spend is just whittling down. So what you want to do is start out what's realistic that you can have now in a year's time. And if you got the maximum of that, what's that total addressable market, rather than saying we can add on this layer and people will stop spending. There's the argument that I remember with Uber, everyone said, oh, people said the total addressable market for Uber would be tiny. The private hire taxi business was small, and people didn't realize that lowering prices would unlock more demand. And that's one of like the classic arguments. And that was true for them. But I think on average, that's wrong. So in that case, it was an error of reasoning that meant you wouldn't see the opportunity size. But on average, the assumption that you can change the market structure and the market dynamic with your product is probably unlikely. So I would say you want to try and model assumptions based on all the variances. It's not for VCs, it's for you, because you need to work out, because building a business is hard enough without kind of messing up the capital structure side of things, because you don't really appreciate the size of the market. And obviously you should aim big. I'm not saying constrain the expectations. It's more just like make sure you've really scrutinized what that market size is, instead of just aiming to have a big one, which I think most people want when they're raising money.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of people who just put the biggest number out there for the TAM because they know that VCs, if they see a number under $1 billion, just won't even look at it because they don't think the opportunity is big enough. So that's where they're focusing all their attention, is making sure they can justify that number rather than making sure they can justify the bottom number. Last question from me, and then I'll take a few more from the chat. And again, if anybody wants to ask anything else, raise your hand or post in the chat. So you started angel investing. How has your experience starting a business impacted how you operate as an angel?
I'd say I'm honestly quite new, so I'm probably not very good, just provably because I haven't done much of it, and I guess there's like quite a long feedback loop to getting to know whether an investment is good or not. I would say, I mean, so far, if I look at our experience and what I see now in terms of the investments being made, I would say generally, and this isn't always possible, like we didn't raise our first Seneca round from family and friends, but I would say the people who are most likely to invest in you are the people who know you well, and or at least are adjacent. I'd say it's very hard to build context on someone in like a 20-minute meeting. So I'd say, how do you try and build credibility and build relationships that can flourish over time? Because I guess if it's you see someone for 2 minutes, that's it. It's very difficult. I'd say a lot of people don't follow up after, which number one is kind of like, that's how you close employees, that's how you close customers. You've got to be kind of on it communication wise. But I would say if I raise money, I try to deliver, I'm going to try and do X, and I'm going to come as close to doing X as I can. And then hopefully if I need more money, those people will be willing. It's the same on a micro level to try and build relationships. It's kind of like, I think a lot of people come into like angel or pitch meetings very transactionally, and it's like, oh, I'll do this chat and then I'll get money after. And I would say actually it's more like, how do you build a relationship long term, where it might be in a week, it might be in a month, it might be in a year, but you continuously communicate with people, they know you're making progress, and there's kind of like a trust built, because it's very hard in a 10-minute thing to get a concrete view, but the 10-minute thing is a launch pad. It might be a week later, it might be a month later, but like keeping people in the loop, continuing to communicate, and like treating it as a relationship rather than like a deal, I think is one thing that is positive, because the things that have gone well so far are people like, not necessarily friends, but I've had continuous exposure to. and therefore you feel more confident in what they're working on, and you build trust that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's someone else that asked about other criteria that you look for as an angel, or any sectors that you're particularly interested in.
I'd say I don't rule anything out, but generally I try to at least have some circle of competence where, like, if I read something and I'm like, I have no idea about this market, I try not to dive in. It might be like a trigger to learn more about it. And again, in keeping with the communication point, it's like keeping someone in the loop with your progress and catching up and keeping people up to date is a way that someone can learn about your market and understand the dynamics. But it's more, if I read something and I don't understand what it is, generally that's a sign that I shouldn't be kind of getting involved. That doesn't mean you can't help out, but it means from like an angel perspective. So I'd say that's kind of, I mean, that's why decks are so important and memos are so important for explaining the context of a market and being precise in that way.
Yeah. Totally different question, but in relation to you moving from Seneca to Novabook in quite a short period of time, launching a new business, how did you actually move on? Scott says both financially and personally, but answer that however you wish. You don't have to go into specifics about financials if you don't want to.
I think I'll go personally, Scott.
Yeah.
I would say, honestly, I think we started so quickly just because, I don't know, I think not doing anything would have been difficult. I don't think that's necessarily the right reason to go and do something straight away. But I think, I don't know, you probably obviously, businesses become quite tied to your identity, like it or not. It's just like if you spend like, I don't know, 80% of your waking time doing something and probably 10% of the residual time you're still thinking about it in some degree, it does become part of you after 8 years. So I'd say partly is that. We're kind of still involved with kind of the business, in touch with the people there. So that's kind of all good. Personally, I'd say, well, how did we get here? Like, we wanted to solve this to support entrepreneurs like all of you. Basically, part of the, I didn't mention this in terms of outline of the deal process. I would say part of what we're trying to do is to try to avoid problems for others. So we uncovered different problems that had been caused by our accountant in the process that are quite financially costly, like 6 or 7 figures, which is not obviously ideal to be losing in a deal based on some kind of advisory, some administrative, but like you don't really want to find those errors because number one, they cost you an arm and a leg in legal fees. And number two, they add another point of discussion and negotiation. I'd say every additional point of negotiation that's unexpected does not help a deal go through. So I would say we kind of partially went through those problems. We also went through some like legal challenges, like our lawyers had to recuse themselves because of something that happened. So we had to change lawyers halfway through. I would basically say trying to avoid all those things and having, I'd say, good kind of infrastructure around you is really good, because I'd say deals are hard and they're very high pressure, which means you need to minimize the kind of unforced errors. And our kind of strategy is minimize those for others going forward. Yeah.
That makes sense. Whilst you're kind of slightly somewhat talking about the exit again, in relation to investment, Scott also asked whether you received any pressure from your investors about the exit and the choice that you made. Were all of them pretty much on board with it, or did you have any more difficult conversations?
Everyone was on board with it. Is there pressure to exit? Not really, like not overtly, not decision making, but I'd say when you talk to people, you can tell what they want you to do, but not like in a bad way. I'd say there weren't any problems and everyone was pretty aligned.
Yeah, that's good. We've got another question from NA, but I'll go to Daniel first so we can listen to someone else's voice for a little bit. So Daniel, do you want to take yourself off mute?
You might regret that. Hey Stephen, how are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks. How are you?
Good. My question's a bit left field actually. Obviously you've been through this whole kind of process of, raising, building, exiting. How have you managed your well-being throughout all of that? Because there's a lot of different pressure points. Just interested on that point.
It's a good question. I'd probably say I'm not a lifestyle guru, Daniel, so maybe not the best. I'd say exercise is good. I think I stopped exercising at different points in the fallacy that kind of like more time at the desk working would be positive. I don't think that's ever true, at least for me. Obviously, it's different stuff for different people. Um, but that's one thing I've tried to maintain now that I probably would have dispensed with last time. So I'd say exercise is good. I would say fundamentally it is difficult. Building a business is hard. It takes a lot of time. It's very hard to separate work and life, I find. Like they do bleed into each other. I think it's more for me, the aim is not separate them. You obviously need to do stuff you enjoy, but the aim is to do something where you're happy with there being spillover to the weekend and the evenings. And that's kind of my acceptance. Like, I don't think it's easy to build a new business and separate them completely. So I'm kind of comfortable with that. Then if you're in that place, it's kind of like, how do I mix and match the other stuff that I would like to do that I think is good for my well-being around that? So I'll basically work Saturdays and Sundays at different points in time and evenings, but it's kind of like, how do you do what you want around that is kind of how I approach it. I wouldn't necessarily advocate that for everyone. It depends on preferences. And that also suits my kind of like personal circumstances as well.
Amazing. It's kind of like that work-life integration type focus. Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, I guess do something you're happy doing. And if it bleeds over, it's not the end of the world. That's kind of like, make sure you're working on something that you like, you feel is meaningful, and you feel contributes to others.
Yeah. Last question from MA, and then I'll ask you quickly to just do a bit of a elevator pitch about Novabook. So the question was about investors and whether you spotted any signs that you thought this investor could cause a bit more hassle down the road.
There are different signs. I wouldn't want to go into too much detail, but I would say if stuff feels atypical, it probably is atypical. Like if you're interacting with 10, 20, 30, 40 investors, if something hasn't happened before, think about why it happens and what the kind of behavior is. I'd say it's pretty similar to social norms, I'd say. But that would be, is there anything that feels strange? And then trust your gut. If it is, it's probably the best case.
Yeah. And in the last minute, just for anyone that's interested, what exactly can Novabook help startups with, and how can people find out more? We do also have a special offer, which we can email everybody afterwards.
Yeah. Sorry to be extremely commercial in the last minute. I'd basically say, like, Novabook, we wanted to try and avoid other founders, entrepreneurs going through the challenges we did. I would say, like, businesses are tough enough without like administrative stuff going wrong. So we just want to make sure everything is set up to support you in the most. I would say the way I think of it is, how can we provide the highest service quality and support to founders at the lowest cost? Make sure your accounting, finances, all that kind of stuff is set up to avoid problems to help you succeed. I'd say around that, we do a whole host of other things. Like, we try and support you as founders. If you want like advice on anything like this, we try and incorporate that into what we offer to try and help people build businesses. Many founders have loads of businesses that are incredibly complicated and well outside like mine and the team's area of expertise from like a building perspective. But if we can help, we always will. From like a founder, whether it's on growth, whether it's on tech, we will always support. And then on the accounting side, we'll do what we can to support and avoid people going through the problems that we had when we were kind of doing different things, going through the exit process. Essentially try and make sure everything's set up properly for you. as well as a whole host of other support if you need it. But the core is, how can we make sure you're set up for success?
Awesome. And I've just posted the link to your website in the chat for anyone that's interested. Like I said, we'll follow up with a few more details. Thank you so much. That was really useful. Thanks for being so open about the exit and how everything came about. That's what a lot of startups are striving for, and even thinking about in the early days of setting up a business. It's like, what does success look like and how do I get there? So appreciate that everybody has their own story, and there's quite a lot of nuances and things that happen that affect whether the opportunity comes up, but just hearing it from your perspective is really valuable. So appreciate you coming in.
No, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
I'm just going to stop recording.